you're on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, my name is Ludwig Siegele. I'm also with The Economist, like Patrick Fowles, but don't worry, not all of the panels will be moderated by Economist journalists. We just kind of happen to all be here. That is not a coordinated effort to sabotage this conference. We're going to talk about data, what should be done about it, how important it is. And when Patrick said, closing his panel, he said, we need a new framework to talk about antitrust and what to do about it. I think data is even more complicated. We need even new words to talk about it. And I mean, I started covering the data economy 2 years ago, and I pitched a briefing, what we call a briefing, 4 pages on the data economy, and I thought, oh, that's going to be fun, that's going to be easy. I can just recycle the 20 years of knowledge I had covering the tech industry. But it was really difficult. It took me 3 or 4 versions to really get it writing it, and I'm still not sure, kind of reading it today, whether I got it. So I hope this panel will help to clarify things here. One of the important questions we are supposed to answer is whether we should create property rights for data. We'll come to that at the end. But let's first do a round of self-introduction. Julia, why don't you?
Self-introduction,
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. I'm Julia Angwin. I'm the token woman on the panel. There'll be one on every panel. And I would also like to say that this is not representative of the field. So in tech policy, I'm a tech journalist. There are many leading women, and I know that the conference organizers are going to work on that for the next round. So I've been a technology journalist for forever. I was at the Wall Street Journal for 14 years, and for the past 4 years at ProPublica. And I've just left ProPublica to found a new newsroom of technology-centered investigations, primarily focusing on the tech platforms, the impact of technology on society. And so I'm basically making a bet that these companies require even more sophisticated watchdogs than are being provided now, and I hope to build that.
So, I mean, how will that work? I mean, you're going to do peer programming or peer journalism or what?
So the way it's going to work is that all the work that I've done for the past 8 years is really like what you would call like pair programming in some ways. So I would sit next to a programmer, and from the very beginning, our investigations use computational techniques. And the way to investigate these platforms is really through computation, because even the people there don't know what is happening, right? When I wrote that you could buy discriminatory ads, housing ads on Facebook, with a drop-down menu saying, don't show my ads to blacks, Facebook was like, oh, we didn't know that was happening, right? So you have to try out the systems, basically pen test them in order to figure out what they're doing, and then often that's news to the companies themselves.
Cool, thank you. Dennis.
I'm an economics professor at the University of Chicago. I specialize in microeconomics and industrial organization. I've been a member of the law school, business school, and economics department, and teach the PhD course this quarter in industrial organization with a specialization and application to antitrust. I've written a lot of articles in antitrust, been at the Department of Justice as the chief economist there, and I work on a lot of antitrust cases. Probably in the interest of full disclosure, I've probably worked for and against many of the companies we're going to talk about today.
Richard.
I'm Dick Schmalensee. I'm an economist at MIT. I've been in the Sloan School of Management and the Department of Economics. I have a short attention span, so I've worked on a variety of subjects over the years, including antitrust policy and how multi-sided platforms operate.
I mean, I read your book, Matchmakers, which I like very much. I think it was one of the better ones on platforms. I mean, if you had to rewrite it, would you change it significantly?
Probably. I can't tell you right now how, but having done a second edition, you find you change more than you think you will when you look at any subject in this area a few years on.
Jonathan?
I'm Jonathan Taplin. I'm the Director Emeritus of the Annenberg Innovation Lab at USC. I came here last year having just published a book called Move Fast and Break Things: How Facebook, Google, and Amazon Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy. It was somewhat of a controversial subtitle at that time. I don't think it is now. I just want to start by thanking Professor Murphy for bringing us into the Chicago School time machine, and belief that when Robert Bork was studying here, he learned everything he needed to know in the 1950s and nothing has changed. I happen to believe that that's not true. I also believe that Silicon Valley would not exist without antitrust. That when the consent decree in 1956 was signed by AT&T that forced them to license their patents for free to any American company, that created Silicon Valley, because the free patents for the transistor, the laser, the cellular system, the satellite, were then given to Hewlett-Packard, Fairchild Semiconductor, Motorola, Texas Instruments, Intel, etc. And that created Silicon Valley out of free patents. And so I do not believe this notion that regulation is a problem I think it's, as I say, it's in the Chicago School time machine, and I think it's worthless.
Tell me about your book, I mean, which I don't completely agree with, but it was immensely well timed. How did you manage that?
Well, I came at it from the point of view originally because I started my career working for Bob Dylan and the band, that musicians and journalists, because I taught at a journalism school, had gotten devastated by the internet. If all your tunes are available for free on YouTube, and there's nothing you can do about that, because YouTube has safe harbor protection for liability, then there's no way you can make a living. And so that, you know, if you look at the revenues in the music business fell by 71% since YouTube started. Revenues at newspapers have fallen by 85% since Google started. This is not a way to sustain a creative economy. And then, beyond that, I began to realize that, needless to say, that the fact that these two basic, as Tristan calls them, attention platforms were the source of 90% of the propaganda, lies, whatever, that distorted elections, not just in the United States, but in Great Britain, in Italy, in France, in other countries, that this was a problem. And as long as these companies feel they do not have to take any responsibility for the content that's on their platform, that is different. That's new. And that's not what the safe harbor was meant to do. It was meant for a network like Verizon, which is just putting bits over the network. YouTube spends millions of dollars filtering out pornography with artificial intelligence. So it's already editing itself, and it edits every feed that each of you gets. It's done by a computer as an editor, but that's the way it is.
Thanks, Jonathan. So Luigi, I don't think you need an introduction. Just let me say thank you for organizing this, for making this possible, and inviting me to moderate it. So I'm going to try to be a little bit contrarian. So data, there's almost kind of a data hype. Data is important. We've written it. We've said it's the world's most valuable resource now. But is that actually true? Let's start with you, Dick. I mean, is data really the thing, or is it oil, or is it more like air?
Well, it's not everywhere. Like air. It's valuable for commercial uses, right? It's valuable for targeting advertising. It's valuable for targeting pricing based on what can be known about your tastes. Not obvious to me that that's the most valuable resource in the world. It's also not obvious to me that that's a terrible thing. I'd rather see ads for things I might be interested in than random ads. Data, however, in the political and social arena, and selling data for use in political campaigns, that is value. And I think one wants to distinguish between the use of data for commercial purposes and the use of data for political and other purposes. The commercial value, I just don't see it, frankly. Amazon knows a lot about me, and Amazon adjusts its pricing and what it shows me. I can't see how that makes them enormously more powerful. I have a sense of what I want to see and what I want to buy, and I don't actually feel driven. Now, maybe some people are, but I see no evidence that data are that important commercially. There are plenty of examples of firms with lots of data having been displaced by firms that don't have data. You know, the counterexamples abound. Not like air. It's valuable, it takes resources to acquire, but not like oil.
But isn't the problem that we view data a bit like oil? And but actually data is fungible, it's different. Each data set is almost different. Kind of, isn't the problem that we haven't kind of come up with a good taxonomy of what data is important? For example, you could argue the social graph of Facebook is a form of data, hugely valuable. Without that, Facebook couldn't make that much money.
But you know, other sorts of data that are publicly available and have been publicly available for a long time are valuable, right? If you know my zip code, you can guess a fair amount about me. If you check the real estate listings, you can get the amount I paid for my home. That tells you something publicly. Anybody can do it. Anybody has done it. And there are a variety of other public sources. The question is there something dramatically new on the commercial side? I distinguish the commercial use of data and its commercial effects.
Why did Facebook and Google get 88% of all new advertising revenue online?
Because they target effectively.
Because they have data.
Because they have data and they target effectively.
Right, so that's a commercial reason that they have advantage.
That is an advantage for them. The question is that really like oil in terms of its value to advertisers? Facebook and Google, by the way, there are an awful lot of searches done on Amazon, which also has data.
Has a lot of data.
Has a lot of data. But it doesn't have to be so valuable as to be sort of unassailable. It just has to be better than the next best alternative to have a share like that. And the next best alternatives aren't very good.
Which is also true of political data. It's just better than the next best alternative. I don't see the distinction, actually. It just.
I have trouble. This is the distinction between antitrust policy and other policy approaches. The sense I got from the first panel was there was almost nothing about antitrust or market competition. There was a lot about political influence and social influence from these panels, from these platforms. So, and the ability to have political effects and social effects may be much more significant than the ability to target ads to me better.
That might be, but I think there's, and I got this from the first panel, there is a confusion when people talk about what are the important issues. They confuse, as Dick was saying, antitrust issues, which has to do with competition, with information issues. And it seems to me you want to keep separate what problem you're solving.
Right.
Otherwise, you're going to wind up solving a problem that's going to cause enormous harm elsewhere. So the question you posed was, is data different? Is data important? Is data more like oil, like a resource, or is it like air, which is a free good?
Not a free
And
good.
I think it's pretty clear it has aspects of both. So George Stigler, and you might not like it if it's a time machine, but he's a pretty thoughtful guy, had some good insights. And he said that information is a scarce resource. It's costly to create, but once you've created a database, its marginal cost is zero. And then along comes people like Joe Stiglitz, and he says, well, yeah, it's a resource, but be careful. Information really has some very special characteristics. There can be asymmetric information. I can know something about myself that you don't know. So if I'm buying insurance, that can cause a problem in the insurance market. If you know something about me, that can cause a harm to me. If I engage in a transaction with, say, Google, and it misuses my data and I didn't know about it, that's maybe consumer deception, but it also creates lots of externalities. It's the creation of these externalities, it seems to me, one of which might be the creation of market power, which is an antitrust issue, but others of which might be identity theft, might be information having to do with my friends, which comes about from a social network. All of these things strike me as slightly different problems, but it's a recognition that information is creating not only problems, but enormous benefits. So when people talk, as they did sometimes in the first panel, but sometimes like they did last year at this conference, about breaking up these companies, you've got to realize a lot of these companies have created enormous value. And if you break them up, you get rid of, you might solve one problem, but you might take us back to the Stone Age. So I agree with what Professor Murphy said, that a lot of these, although the exact type of problem is different, different issues, we faced a lot of these in antitrust and in consumer harm that the FTC looks at, consumer deception. And we have, at least in antitrust, a framework. When it comes to democracy and political issues, that's much scarier to me. That is much scarier to imagine. You can imagine a totalitarian regime having very detailed data about every individual, where you walk, who you're talking to. My God, you could think of, if the KGB had that, that'd be pretty, maybe they do have it, I don't know. It's a scary thought that a government would have that. And that, I think, raises separate issues. It also raises very interesting economic issues that economists, I don't think, have paid enough attention to. We've talked about identity theft. We haven't talked much about blackmail. Suppose I know everything about Dick's social network, and he's talking to some person and who's of questionable reputation. And now I publicize that. Well, that'll cut down on free speech, on his ability to interact with people. Do we want that? Those are issues that are problems, clearly, but you want to make sure you don't identify a solution to a problem that then is going to have enormous effects elsewhere and really reduce the benefits that come about. And antitrust can deal a little bit with that. We'll hopefully deal with that later on the panel when maybe people answer the questions that are posed to them. But if not, I'll chime in and tell you what I think about antitrust.
But let me just come back to this discussion of antitrust and regulation. There is a tendency, and we heard a little bit of it in the first panel, to treat regulation like peanut butter. We'll put a little more on. Well, to think about exactly what you would regulate here and how you would do it. I mean, the Europeans have an answer. They have this, 500-page directive about data and privacy that is very hard to figure out, probably hard to comply with. American companies doing business in Europe will have to comply with it. Do we want to go down that road? Does that solve the right problems? Does it address the right problems? Is it too complicated? I think, in a way, information accumulation is a little like learning by doing in the old days. If you do more, your production costs fall, and that gives you an advantage over competitors. If you have more users, your data rise, and you have an advantage over competitors. Antitrust deals with these things. The broader social and political issues, we don't have a framework for, I don't think.
Okay, Luigi, do you agree?
I think I actually agree with a bit of both. I think it's very important to separate the issue, as Dennis said. I think that the privacy issue is enormous, and it's probably not an issue that antitrust should deal with, but is an important issue that society should deal with. And I'm not so sure that the European solution is the right one, but at least it's a solution. I think in the United States, we have punted on that. And honestly, I am afraid that the government will own this information. And actually, I think the Chinese government does. Now with face recognition, you know who is where in China in every place. I think that the big brother is there. I fear that. But I don't think that if Mark Zuckerberg knows all that, I am much more at peace. I think I'm worried of concentration of too much power, whether it is in the public sector or in the private sector. So I think that that is one issue that should be dealt with. The other issue is the valid information and from a societal point of view, what is the optimal use of this information? Because Dennis is right. Information is something that is very costly to acquire. Once you have it, the marginal cost of distributing is basically zero. And so even if I don't like it, but this is clearly something that there are some big economies of scale, and so don't you want to maybe centralize this collection and distribute it more freely. So, for example, or allocate the ownership in a different way. I very much like the open
Could we talk
banking.
about this in another round?
Okay.
Okay. I mean, I was
Can
just
I
wondering.
just
I was
say
just
one
wondering.
thing? Can I just ask my two free market colleagues here? Do you believe that having 90% market share in a category is a monopoly? Professor Carlton.
Yeah,
Well,
a category.
a category, a random category, or just a relevant antitrust
Google has
market?
90% market
So
share
let
in
me
search advertising.
let me answer the question.
Yeah.
The answer is, as Professor Murphy clearly stated, concentration is not the objective. It's not to prevent high concentration. It's to promote the provision of good service and goods that consumers desire. If one firm is more efficient than everybody else, that will lead to a concentrated market, and that can be good. It is also true that if one firm has a disproportionate share of a market, that can be bad, depending upon how they acquired it. In the United States, it is not an antitrust violation to be a monopolist. The law has been clear, and our antitrust judges, I think before economists caught on to this, recognize that it's the process of competition that you want to keep as fair, and and not to tilt the playing field. A misuse of market power to keep your share, that's something that can be attacked. And as for free market, the definition of free market, there's no economist that I'm aware of who would say that a free market solves all problems. Every economist I know would say, even what you would dub pejoratively a free market economist, believes that there is an appropriate role for both regulation and government intervention, and that appropriate role is to preserve the process of competition. Now, that's from the anti-competitive, from preserving competition. These issues that arise about democracy and the control of information, those I think are outside the bounds of antitrust, and I think they do deserve to be considered,
But can
as
you
well as
make-
the
can you- sorry.
protection, as well as the protection of privacy, which I hope
Can
we
you
get
make
to.
that differentiation between a distinction between having data, lots of data, and political power, and lots of data and economic power? Is that
Absolutely.
I think it is an absolute distinction, and I think the way to get to that is to think about restrictions on the use of data. I mean, you could imagine a world in which Google simply could not sell, or Facebook could not sell information it gathered from users on its or any other website. If you have a reasonable expectation of privacy when you're on Facebook, that expectation must be maintained unless you give explicit permission to sell your data. That's a different regime, and that would mean that you could change and let me not pursue that farther than I've thought, but you could imagine restrictions of that kind that would change the use of data for political purposes. You could also say can't be used for targeting political ads, period, full stop.
But that's exactly what GDPR is trying to do, what the Europeans are trying to do.
I'm not saying that that's a wrong thing. It's not an antitrust question, and let me just come back a little bit to Dennis's point. The Europeans go farther than we do on firms with market power, and they say there's a set of actions that may not maintain a monopoly, but that is an abuse of a monopoly or of a dominant position in their language. We could go there. They've gone there. They've gone after Google and others. I don't think that's a fundamental difference. It's a difference. But both traditions say that firms that have acquired a good deal of market power deserve and get closer scrutiny to make sure that their conduct does not interfere with competitive processes.
Can I just say one thing just to clarify? So Google and Facebook do not sell data, so this model of like you would opt in to have it sold is not actually the right. They hoard it. And actually what they do is lease people's attention and target data based on that. So just a clarifying point there. maybe I'll just jump in on this in general, which is I am not an antitrust economist. I'm a journalist, so I'm not going to wade into the waters of what is antitrust and what's not. I will say, though, that I've thought a lot about privacy. I wrote a book about it in 2014 called Dragnet Nation, and I think one of the most compelling comparisons for data externalities is pollution. So data harms are very similar to pollution harms in the fact that they're hard to attribute to a cause, right? You might be notified that you're targeted by Cambridge Analytica, but in most cases, you're not going to know what data was used to make a decision about you, right? And also there's just a collective harm, right? Like everybody in a neighborhood is getting black smoke, and no one can say why they have cancer, and it's really difficult to solve that. And the same thing with what we're seeing now with what you're calling, the political harms are maybe more meaningful to you, commercial harms might be more meaningful to others, but the truth is that those harms are collective, right? The mass manipulation of people is really the intent of this data, is being used to mass manipulate people, whether it's for political or commercial realms. And so I think the way that we addressed pollution is interesting because it was everything from social norms of changing our recycling habits to very strict emission rules, right? Like Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and then we also had like some intermediate steps like public shaming, the toxic release inventory, where you see a list of all the companies that release the most, and people would compete to not be on that list, right? And so I think we have a model for this type of thing that's happened before, if you agree that these negative externalities matter, and maybe only some of them matter in this context of antitrust, or maybe they don't matter at all in antitrust, but they are harms in some way that I think are worth discussing.
So we already in the debate about kind of remedies, what to do about data, which I
You were trying to hold that off.
I was trying to hold that off. So I just want to kind of ask a few questions about kind of the nature of data in terms of kind of do we have decreasing or increasing returns to scale, or are they a barrier to entry? So Dennis, talk to me a bit about that. I mean, how do you conceptualize that? I mean, are there something like data network effect, so more data begets even more data? Does that pose a problem, increasing, decreasing returns to scale? Yeah.
Well, there's no question that there can be increasing returns to scale from data collection. And in the earlier panel, there was the discussion about the virtuous circle. So search engines become better as they learn and get larger. So there's no question there can be scale economies. The hard issue is that good or bad?
Right.
In other words, your benefit is firms get more efficient if they then lower the prices. So it seems to me, from an antitrust point of view, what the collection of data and the existence of databases cries out for is, has there been a misuse in the acquisition of that data? So, for example, let me just give you an example. Let's suppose, so I don't have to talk about a specific firm. Dennis Carlton has the best search engine in the world, okay? And let's suppose I also am gathering information of where everybody's going. And then Dick comes along and he says, gee, I can do a better job of placing ads if I had all this data that Dennis has. And he says, I want Dennis's data. And I say, I'm not going to give you my data. It costs me a fortune to collect it and to store it. And then he says, okay, you know what? I would like the ability to put cookies on the websites where people are going. And the websites say, fine. And I say, no way, you can't do that. If you want to have access to my search engine, no one else can put cookies on a third-party website and gather information. Well, that would be could be, I'm not going to say would be, could be an antitrust. It's a restriction on use. That is, even if I recognize the database is costly to create, and therefore you shouldn't steal it from me if I created it, I also recognize under the antitrust laws that I shouldn't be protected in the sense that I can protect myself from competition. That's the way an antitrust regime could address at least some of these problems. The other one would be mergers. Let's suppose there's a third party that has a big database, and I want to merge with them, even if we're doing different things with the database. Would it be a reasonable question to ask? Is that appropriate? Yes, it's a reasonable question. Whether you should block it or not, I don't know. For another very interesting question from an antitrust point of view about these databases, has to do with price discrimination. Here there is a difference between Europe and the United States. In the United States, we care much less about price discrimination than they do. Well, now, if someone has a lot of data about dentists, they can price discriminate.
Right.
Suppose I didn't want anyone to have that data. So this really goes to an intersection between privacy and antitrust that the person who just spoke raised. How do I protect someone from getting information about me that can harm me? That seems to me a problem. Speaking about externalities, though, suppose I'm on Facebook and you see my social network. There's an externality, right? Someone's getting information about who I talk to. And those people had no say. Even if Dennis said, I don't care if you give up information. Those people don't have a say. So I think there are all sorts of externality problems. I don't think antitrust is hard to deal with. What antitrust can deal with is what question you raised. Databases, scale economies, can we deal with that? Yes.
Can I come back to this just briefly, because it's clear, as Dennis says, that there can be scale economies, which are a little bit like learning economies actually, that building a database is valuable, becomes more valuable. The question is, how important is that? And I think that varies from sector to sector. Apple Music had how many million customers when Spotify entered? Spotify took over the market. Facebook entered India, where it had no customers and no data, and took over from the leading social network. Facebook took over from MySpace. There are jillions of examples of companies with no data entering successfully against companies with lots of data. Data are valuable, but they're not the only thing that matters in competition. And to say, well, data is so valuable that once they get data, they're unassailable, I think history has proven that wrong dozens of times. So, yes, we got to worry about it commercially and from an antitrust perspective, but I think, at least based on history, the major worries are elsewhere.
Jonathan.
So I keep hearing this notion that, well, concentration may not be bad, but competition is good. So there's no competition in the search market, none. There's very little competition in the social media space. Facebook-owned companies have 75% of mobile social traffic. Now, a Brandeisian would say, well, why don't we break up Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger and make them compete against each other, and maybe one of them might offer me a service that's less privacy intrusive, less surveillance oriented, and then we'd have a situation, and I won't have to be monitoring the Facebook ecology from the FTC and trying to keep one step ahead of them, but their tricks to try and make me do stuff.
Do they all have the same
So-
data? Do you break up the Google search engine, and if so, what does that mean?
Well, no.
What does it mean?
The suggestion had been split YouTube off from Google. They both have 100, close to 1 billion customers, and they would compete against each other. So, I mean, the point is, the breaking up these companies would not be hard. And I'm not suggesting that's the only solution. It seems to me the biggest problem is that unlike every other company, and I'll just read something from a conservative letter a group of conservatives wrote to Chairman Goodlatte yesterday. In the offline world, businesses are expected to take reasonable steps to prevent their services from being used to facilitate harmful activity. The same is not true online, where platforms are increasingly at the center of wrongdoing, but remain unaccountable for the abuse they enable. So it just so happens that Facebook and Google, YouTube are protected under the safe harbor. It was a law that was meant to protect big networks like Verizon, which don't do anything. They're neutral networks and don't do anything with the bits, but needless to say, we all know that YouTube filters out porn, sometimes doesn't filter out ISIS stuff. All these things are happening. But if there are 45,000 ISIS videos on YouTube, many of them being monetized by advertising, is that a social good or not? I don't think so. I just want to suggest one other thing, which Jonathan Citron of Harvard put forward. He said, lawyers and doctors are prohibited from using clients' information for their own interests. So why aren't Facebook and Google under the same kind of fiduciary responsibility as data holders? I gave them my data
think
for
so.
the particular use of connecting me with other people and maybe of showing me some relevant advertising.
Yeah, I think that's
I
I think that's a great question, actually, because who owns the data seems like a central issue.
Well, you heard Mark Zuckerberg say, I own the data.
Right.
But
Well,
that's not true. We
so
know
So there are
Facebook
two.
owns
Maybe
there,
true.
there are two ways to think about this, and about ownership of data. The first is you could imagine that you own the data, and Facebook has to convince you to give it to them. And I fear, especially young people, they'd
Right.
say, "Fine."
Take it.
And I'd say, "Oh my God," especially for my kids. I said, "Don't, no." But I actually think most people would say yes. So that worries me. So I don't think solving that,
Right.
the data sale will solve it. However, you raise a good question about healthcare. As I understand it, no one can prevent me from asking my doctor for my health information and me then giving it to another doctor. I have a property right in that. I don't have a property right. It's
Facebook.
called Google and do it.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Or Facebook.
now, if I don't consent to having my data collected, maybe I should also have the ability to have access to my database. Now, that's not Google's database, because Google's put together presumably a lot of money to construct it. But maybe there's some simple data that
Your data set.
Well, but
Well-
it's
Well, can I
not
just
it's
say
not clear what that is.
You're talking
Okay.
about an access right, not a property right, and I just want to make that distinction because actually the thing about data that's so complicated is it's endlessly replicable, right? And
Right.
so in the sense that the GDPR and the European model has been to provide access rights, and that is great for transparency. It hasn't changed the behavior of the companies at all, and it probably won't because they have a copy too, right? They're still going to do all the things they're going to do with it. And so I just want to make that one distinction.
Yeah, but the point I was trying to make is, I might say to Google, you can't sell my data. I have a property right in it. But it also could be this, I mean, I might do it, my kids might not. But what I'm saying is, I could, even if I sold it to Google, still have a property right that I retain in it that doesn't make Google the exclusive owner of my
Correct.
data.
There could
And
be
therefore, I
co-ownership,
could
right.
give my data to another competitor who
Right.
could start a competitor and overcome this data in part. The
This
data
notion,
advantage.
I could move my social graph from Facebook to Spotify.
And everything else they have.
To some other company.
Yes,
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
that requires interoperability, is a point
a
Kevin
huge
raised.
issue.
And that's a difficult issue because it's costly thing, so you got to figure that out. But that at least is one
mean,
way to do it, but I think that's
This
different.
is why I, by the way, tried to. I wanted
Yeah.
to copyright my children's images, their faces. I asked the lawyers; they said I couldn't. But the thing is, I wanted that DMCA takedown thing to get their videos down from YouTube because, as you know, like anybody with copyright could go to YouTube and they have an automated form like take down my copyrighted material. But if some other parent films my children and puts them up on YouTube, I literally
have the
have no
copyright.
rights, right? And so I looked into whether I could get those rights over my children. Turns out I'm not allowed to do that. But I do think that speaks to the feeling we have, which is we do feel like we have some ownership in our data. But I agree with you on the property rights issue that it is a kind of dangerous road to go down. If you think about how humans used to sell their labor into the market, right? When there was a free market, people would sell 18 hours of their labor into the market. And it wasn't until government stepped in and said you can really only force people to work, 8 hours, et cetera, that people, because people don't have the leverage, right? And the same thing is true with your data. You don't really have any leverage. It's not worth that much individually. So the problem with data is it's only worth a lot in its aggregate pool. Right. Your data is actually sort of horribly cheap, right? Like any bit of it is like a partial cent, right? It trades on these online ad markets for like 1/8 of a cent.
Right.
Luigi, I mean, is property rights and data, is that a solution? And to what problem, of course?
I think it's one solution to one problem. I think, unfortunately, we mix a lot of problems, and it's hard to sort of decide what is most important to do. Whether this is related to antitrust or not, I think the big question is, do we have some efficiency problems, and what are the right tools to address them? And I think that allocation of ownership is important And I think that Europe is ahead on this. There is the open banking that is taking place also in England, where you can, as Dennis was saying, ask your bank to transfer all the information about you to another potential lender of yours or bank of yours. In the same way in which we have number portability in our cell phones, this was introduced by regulation. It's not that something that naturally arose. But today everybody agrees it's a great thing, and without that we'll have less competition. And I think that having the same level of portability of the data or even the social graph is crucial. Is something that needs to happen by regulation. I don't think that this is an antitrust issue. It's a regulation issue.
But I mean,
But also,
if we legally define ownership to personal data, does that help? I mean, is that the right way to go? Because I wonder, it's really hard to decide on Facebook, for example, social graph. Mm-hmm. Do you own that? Do your friends own that? Are you allowed to export that? Or I mean, data is always a social construct or information.
Of course, there are important issues on defined property, but let me tell you that what I discovered, which is pretty amazing, is if I give you my login and password on Facebook, and with my consent, you come in Facebook and you log in, you commit a federal crime. You can go to jail for that. Why? Because basically Facebook had litigated this because there was a startup that was trying to increase interoperability. So it was trying to get into Facebook and other social networks and get the data so that to make it easier for me to access multiple social networks at the same time. And I think that what I see as good public policy is to try to increase this interoperability, because that's what reduces the network externality that creates all the problems that exist in this market. This is when phone companies started, they forced interoperability because otherwise it would have been a mess. And I think that that's what we need to do in terms of social graph. And I think is the least intrusive way to get at least into this issue of Facebook, etc. Now, there is a second problem which is more difficult. It is the ownership of data today, because we can change the future, we cannot change the past. Today, Facebook, Google, Amazon own a lot of data about the past. And as I understand, artificial intelligence needs a lot of data to do anything new. So that does create a competitive advantage to the incumbents in starting new businesses. So, and I have to say, I'm not an antitrust expert. This is what I asked Dennis and Dick, who are antitrust experts, is to say, suppose that I am a sort of a concentrated entity like Google, that I accumulated a lot of data. This is, as they say very clearly, is a legitimate monopoly in the United States. But thanks to that data, now they can enter a lot of other businesses at a strict comparative advantage. Is this an antitrust issue or not?
No, what you're proposing, kind of sharing the social graph, kind of that's in tension with privacy. The GDPR, for example, doesn't allow this, and I think, Ben, you wrote about this. The GDPR bans you from exporting or kind of sharing your social graph. Is that correct?
Well, it's unclear.
Yeah.
Certainly, it makes your data extraction much easier, as it can't just be down in a PDF like that today. The question as to how much of your friend's data in relation is basically pretty undefined under this.
The GDPR requires the data that you access to be machine readable for the first time ever. So previously they would give it to you in a very unreadable format. But it basically it's going to be fought in the courts as to what they're going to give you, right? So they're going to probably give you very little, and then there'll be a bunch of battles for 10 years, and then maybe they'll give you the full set.
But let's be clear about what problem we're addressing. If you're making data more portable and more accessible, you're making it easier for new entities to do political targeting with data. All I have to do is say, I'd like to buy your data for 25 cents. Most people will sell their data for 25 cents. If you make data completely free, first of all, you affect the incentives to accumulate it, just like any other property right. And you may make more competition, given the level of data that's available. But the issues we heard about in the morning, it's not clear to me it touches those. It may give you more competition in search, maybe. Maybe not. More competition in social networks if people care a lot about privacy, which they don't seem to too much. We'll see. But I don't think it affects any of the issues about social and political effects.
Yeah, I agree with that. And sort of in terms of antitrust, what is interesting is these are, although of a different quantitative significance, but these are issues that have been addressed over the years. Trade associations collect data. The question is, to whom should they make that data available? Can they only make it available to some people and not others? There was a big issue with insurance companies. Insurance companies pool data to get a better statistical estimate of risk. Is that legal or not? Can they exclude people? There were big antitrust issues about that. When markets, organized markets, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, when they form, are they required to make their data available instantaneously, or the New York Stock Exchange, on what prices are, so that other people can transact off the exchange and avoid the exchange fees? Those are issues that come up. There were recent investigations during the financial crisis, when or right around then, when banks were trying to have consortiums. Well, they were excluding other people, and it was the data of their customers that allowed them to try and create a market. So think about real estate, multiple listing services, data, again. So and we talked this morning about bias. People have mentioned Google search bias. There were a whole slew of antitrust issues that arose, having to do with bias systems that the airlines use. They were called computer reservation systems then. So these are all problems that, from an antitrust point of view, although they're hard questions, we have the tools to deal with. Much more complicated are these privacy issues, I think. And the difficulty I see, if you make all databases available, as Dick was saying, you're going to exacerbate many of these problems that have to do with security, that have to do with blackmail, that have to do with someone knowing information about me that's going to impose a cost on me. So you've got to be really careful which road you go down. It seems to me what no one has talked about, what has always bothered me, is I don't know how I would press one button and secure privacy. It seems to me, I have to worry about my browser, I have to worry about my search engine, I have to worry about how many people have cookies on every website I go to. What I would need if I were recommending a regulator to give me some privacy rights, I want one button to push, and when I am now on the computer for the next 60 seconds, I don't want anybody to know anything. I don't know how to do that. I don't know if it's possible to do. There are engines, someone mentioned DuckDuckGo, for example, that says doesn't put cookies on you. All right, maybe it doesn't put cookies on you, but what about after? You go to some website from DuckDuck, eventually. Does that website gather information? Well, if it does, then what's the big deal if DuckDuckGo doesn't? So that's why I think there's very many different issues, and the antitrust issues really seem, these privacy issues and issues having to do with democracy and influencing people's opinions, those really seem separate. The only final thing I want to say about influencing people, this came up in the 50s. I mean, Galbraith wrote books about misleading advertising and how we were distorting things. So again, these are issues we've seen. They have come up in a different guise, and maybe they're much more pointed now with these new techniques. But they are issues people have worried about, and I think lawyers actually have spent more time than economists worrying about privacy issues, and they probably have a lot to add about the benefits of intervening and the costs.
No, wait a second. On the privacy issue, I think that one thing that would be useful, have some form of electronic identity that allows us to go to places and share only what is relevant to these places. The way David Birch, for example, describes it is when I want to know, I want to go to a place and drink, the only thing I have to show is that I'm above 21. I don't have to show when I was born. And if I am sort of some vanity, I don't want to show my age, I can keep it secret. And today you cannot do it because you have to show your ID in the physical world. And of course, in the electronic world, it's much, much worse because what all these places do is they ask you to register in some way or another. Yesterday I was in a cab in Washington, and in order to get the receipt, I had to type my damn phone number. And so now the cab company had the phone number.
Yeah.
And this is sort of really annoying because I was in a hurry. I was kind of in a situation in which I needed to have the receipt, otherwise I would not get reimbursed, and I was forced to give my phone number. So why don't we think about a system where we can share what is relevant and we don't have to give away all the information? This is intrinsically doable with the technology. It's just that, I'm sorry to say, is something that you need a sort of a third party to do it, because if it's done by Amazon, it's done by Google, it's done by a private entity, this is a disaster because it's done to appropriate this information. You need to have either sort of a super partes consortium or the government involved. Now, the government generally doesn't work very well, so we need to find, but I think that a lot of effort should be put in this direction, in trying to reduce the amount of data we give away for nothing, and try to protect our identity.
Julia, let me
Yeah.
the question, do you
Yeah.
wanted to comment on that? But
Yeah.
just let me add,
Right.
do what Luigi said at the end, do you think kind of digital identity is such an important form of data or data set that it should be controlled by government or some quasi-government authority?
So what I want to say is, I'm going to address that, is generally, I think, overall, the word privacy is the wrong word. It's too broad, and it encompasses too many things. And what it really means is like, I want to be alone, which is not actually what we're always talking about, right? So really the issues break down into different things. Like, so for instance, when you show your ID at the bar, what you really want to do is authenticate, right? So we have an authentication issue, right? We also have an anonymity issue, right? Like we want to browse for medical conditions and not have anyone track us, right? And so we need to break these things apart, and then there's solutions for each one of them. So for authentication, there are plenty of technical ways to do online authentication where you don't have to know anything. It's called zero knowledge proof, where you basically are able to authenticate your age, for instance, with both sides not knowing any more than they need to know, right? It's just that the problem is there's no market incentive for anyone to build these things because we're in a data economy, so over collection and hoarding is the business model. And so until that sort of incentive is changed, you can't solve these actually fairly known solvable problems. Now, when it comes to digital identity, that is one that's very complicated, right? Because there are situations like, for instance, filing the IRS e-file the other night was a nightmare. I don't know if you know, but the whole system went down and they had a massive authentication failure. And essentially, my husband and I went through these steps where they said the only things you could use to authenticate your identity were a mortgage, a credit card, and one or two other things that most drivers' registration, they were things that like poor people might not have, right? And so we have not solved government identity authentication. And it's pretty controversial to call for that, but the NIST has been working on a digital identity standard. And of course, the people who want to build it are all the tech companies, which is unfortunate because like that's the last people probably we want to do it. But it is something that it should probably be considered in a very thoughtful way, right?
I think the question of how to get
Sorry,
this.
this was Jonathan's turn. I'm sorry.
So I'm a little worried that we're spending most of our time on the privacy issue, because this is, after all, in part an antitrust conference. And I think Luigi alluded to the future in the sense of if artificial intelligence becomes as powerful as I think it will be, the people that will dominate artificial intelligence will be the people that have the most data. And let's be clear, Google, Facebook, and Amazon have the most data by far. And I can tell just from being at USC that the kids in the engineering school who are working in artificial intelligence all want to go to Google, Amazon, and Facebook, because that's where the giant data sets is. Those are the companies that can pay the most money. Those are the companies that are getting the best professors there. And it is, Dennis called it a virtuous circle, but it really is a virtuous circle that we don't have any idea of how far it goes.
Right.
You've probably seen the new Google advertisements, let Google do it. So this is a world that was referenced earlier in the last session about a world in which voice is the only way that you interface and you interface with one company that has now got your voice thing, and that's your assistant, and that company is not going to give you a level of choices like a search engine. It's going to give you the answer for what you want and everything. And that is a level of power to me that seems way beyond what. And if we look at Ben Thompson's charts, it would seem to me that the strong are going to get stronger and stronger. I was with the most important institutional investor in America 3 weeks ago, and he said, as far as we're concerned, Google, Facebook, and Amazon, barring regulatory problems, are going to rule for the next 20 years. And I think that's true. I do not think there's a market solution. If I ask the people in this room to give me money to go into business to compete with Google in the search engine space, you would all run for the exits. That's a fool's errand. And so I don't think this is going to change, barring some way to regulate these companies in antitrust. Now, maybe the FTC investigation on Facebook and data privacy will be a start. We'll see whether the regulatory agencies are up for it. I think it'll be interesting to hear from our Assistant Attorney General at lunch to see what he thinks the world is going to be, and maybe things will be different. But as far as I'm concerned, we've had 20 years of regulatory capture and nothing has happened on the antitrust side.
Well, I would distinguish, again, between antitrust and regulation. Antitrust has tools that can preserve the process of competition and can make sure that you're not doing anything to enhance your market power above and beyond your legitimately created market power. Now, regulation is different. So, we regulate electricity, for example. You wouldn't say that's an antitrust regulation, it's regulation. Now, there may be areas where antitrust doesn't work, in which case you want to have regulation. That's why I think people are talking about privacy. But there are areas where antitrust works, and there I would, let the competitive process work. If someone is so entrenched that they're a monopolist and the industry is static, maybe regulation is good. But if that's not the case, and I wouldn't describe, maybe, a tight regulation of an industry is good. But if that's not the case, and you have a very rapidly evolving industry, and you propose regulation, you got to realize you may be creating and deterring the creation of a lot of new products that customers want. That's why you really got to define the problem. The problem you just defined is that right now, Facebook and Google have large shares. And what can I do about it? Well, the only thing you can do logically, if you are opposed to large shares, is to break them up. Do I think that's a good idea? That is not the position our antitrust laws have taken. As long as you've become a monopolist by legitimate means.
But
now,
then
if it's by illegitimate means, you could break them up.
Would you say would you say that large accumulations of data of all kinds, kind of the commercial kind, the kind that is politically behavioral kind, will never be a problem, that you should not do something to limit that? Is there not a point?
But that's the point I'm trying to make. To say you should do something about it. The question is, do you want to use the antitrust laws to just stop breaking up companies because they're making money? That would go against the use of our antitrust laws.
Our economies of scale, which give a competitive advantage, are they never going to be a problem? One firm is much larger and has large economies of scale. It's hard for other people to compete. That's been an issue that the antitrust laws have faced for decades. Let me pause there.
Dennis, I think you're right. Google acquires its ability and its market share through ability, and so that fits perfectly Google. Take Facebook, for example. WhatsApp and Instagram were two acquisitions. So I think those, we could say, did the merger review of those acquisitions behave properly? And again, I'm not an antitrust expert, but I think you can go back and say, maybe we made a mistake. And we should break them up because we made a mistake.
I agree with that. So that was exactly my point when you were acquiring data.
Yeah.
If data is a scarce resource and people can't reproduce it easily, you wouldn't allow any two firms to emerge if it's going to reduce competition.
There's
Yeah.
also
So
At
that I
the
agree
conference
with.
last year,
And so
one
wait,
of
so
the
that I
arguments-
agree with.
Yeah.
There are other antitrust techniques you can use that can not just preventing mergers, but also preventing certain business practices that make it more difficult for your rivals. Those are the tools of antitrust, and antitrust can be used to do that. I just am trying to distinguish.
No, I understand.
And
completely, but what is the
antitrust
efficient?
can block a merger where the acquired company is a potential competitor. I mean, you have to do more than wave your hands at potential
No, of
competitor.
course.
But if it is, then you of a dominant firm, you can say, we shouldn't allow that merger.
What is the efficiency reason to have Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp together? I understand that breaking up Google per se, forget YouTube for a second, would be crazy because there are enormous economies of scale. But in the case of Facebook and Instagram, etc., I don't see the social cost.
You don't have to prove efficiencies for a merger to go through. The standard goes the other way. You have to prove no anti-competitive effects, to simplify. So they don't have to say, gosh, we're going to be so much better. They only have to say, they'll say it, but they only have to say that substantively if there is an anti-competitive risk. And in the cases you're talking about, it seems to me the anti-competitive risk is they were potential competitors.
Last year at this conference, one of the EU competition competitors said, when we reviewed the WhatsApp acquisition by Facebook, they promised us that they would never merge the databases and the advertising back ends of those two companies, that they were two totally separate companies. And after the acquisition, we realized that they had already done it at the very point they were telling us they would never do it. And then now they fined them $250 million, which was couch change for Facebook, and so, nothing really happened, but that's the kind of thing exactly that you're talking about.
Yeah, although I've always found that a little weird.
That's
so
weird.
Just think about it. There are two
That's the
databases,
economy.
and they merge, and they say, we have these great scale economies. And we say, well, you can merge, but don't use the scale economies. It makes no sense. The only thing that can happen is consumers are better off. But the real issue is if those are two valuable databases, and those, as Dick was saying, and those guys are potential competitors, maybe I shouldn't have let them merge.
in the first place.
Not that I'll let you merge, but don't take advantage of efficiencies. That unless there's some other reason that I don't understand. But
Okay.
just saying,
You've let them
you
merge,
guys
yeah.
can merge, but don't lower your costs of manufacturing. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me as an economist.
Julia,
You might
you
stop
wanna-
the merger, but because there's going to be a restriction on competition.
Before you say something,
Okay.
I'm going to open this up to a question from the audience after
Okay,
what you have
great.
to say.
Oh, good, I got the last word.
So prepare your question.
I just want to say, we're talking a lot about the concentration of, the social apps, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. But in terms of, I think this is the appropriate term in antitrust circles, right? In terms of the relevant market here is online advertising. That's the market they're in. They really don't give a shit about the user. Sorry, excuse my language. So the advertisers are their customers. And if you think about the relevant market, Facebook and Google literally completely overwhelmingly dominate that market. And I want to bring it back to what Dick was talking about in the beginning, which is there a harm? And I want to bring just one specific harm that I think we should just think about, which is in the old days, when I worked at the Wall Street Journal, the reason the Wall Street Journal had tons of reporters and good quality journalism was because it was the only way you could reach, middle-aged white guys with a BMW who golfed. And that was why you paid the money to get a $350,000 for a full-page ad. Well, what happened was when you went online, Facebook or Google, they just follow those people around and they're like, I can get you a middle-aged white guy who golfs with a BMW much cheaper. And by the way, they're more likely to look at your ad on Breitbart where they're not really paying attention to the content than they are when next to this very absorbing, well-written Wall Street Journal article. And so that is the destruction of the newspaper industry I've just described to you, right?
Yep.
It's dead. And also, this is where commercial and political cross over, because journalism is the watchdogs of democracy, right? We do some other stuff too, music reviews, whatever. But mostly our mission is to be the watchdogs of powerful institutions. And so the evisceration of independent, fearless journalism in this country is the harm of commercial data gathering. And so I guess I just want to leave you all with that thought before we go to questions.
On that, questions. Where is the microphone?
Good point.
One of the things here that no one's mentioned is it's government policy that everything here is happening. It's the law in the sense we have government-granted market power, riskless innovation, and riskless operation. That's why Facebook, Google, and Amazon are who they are. They're allowed by law to disregard consumer safety and consumer privacy. You don't know that? Well, let me tell you, look in the 1996 Telecom Act. They were given 3 privileges. By law, they were internet services were exempt from all FCC regulation, so any consumer security, any consumer privacy. The government, in law, exempted them from that. Second of all, they said it's the policy of the United States that the internet should be unfettered, internet companies should be unfettered by federal and state regulation. Boom, it's in the law. But the big one that people don't realize about, the immunity for under Section 230 that said that an interactive computer service, basically you don't have to either protect people from harm, you don't have to do anything. You are immunized from any civil liability. So what my question is why wouldn't we just change existing policy that doesn't create asymmetric accountability? 99% of the economy has to obey every normal law. We had privacy, we had security before 1996. What people don't realize, everything we're complaining about right now, it's in law, and we've immunized and we have exempted these companies from any responsibility or accountability to other people. So my question is that smart with given everything we're talking about? Should we first think about not immunizing and not exempting the companies that have problems from continuing their problems?
Dick, you want to take that?
Not really, but I will. I think it probably sounded like a great idea in 1996 to encourage innovation, to let the internet do what the internet was going to do. I think all of the discussion so far suggests that it's probably a good idea to re-examine policy on a number of fronts. I'm not an expert on the impact of that law or what it exactly does, but it seems to me we have all said that it's worth taking a hard look at government policy. I would add the caveat to just echo Luigi a little bit to say we're going to let the FCC write the rules here is not an appealing prospect. You end up with something like the European impenetrable policy. So I think we do need the private sector to save itself from itself to some extent by coming up with workable alternatives to the current regime.
It's also worth noting that Congress has taken the first crack at whittling away that Section 230 exemption with the passage of a bill that says in the case of sex trafficking, you do have to have liability. Now, I would imagine they might add a few other things, terrorism, et cetera, over time.
And Google and Facebook fought that right up to the very end.
There's a great quote from some congressman during the Zuckerberg testimony saying Congress is good at 2 things, doing nothing and overreacting. and I think the industry may be in for a bout of overreacting, which can also be harmful.
And they watch and forget as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Next question here. Over there. Yeah.
Question for Julia. One of the things that you hear a lot about is the surveillance economy and how this isn't really advertising. What we're talking about is actually Google and Facebook collecting all this data, 360 degrees of data, to surveil you and let people onto their surveillance network and target the ad through the surveillance network. Is that worth thinking about in terms of a distinction between an advertising market or a healthy advertising market that you discuss and a surveillance market and economy?
Yeah, I think the surveillance economy is a good way to describe what the advertising business has become online and really the business model of almost every internet service. And it's worth thinking about because as much as it seems like maybe innocuous, like maybe Mark Zuckerberg might be a nice guy, but it is the government gets to dip its hands in that, right? I mean, that is essentially, the government always retains that right to come to those companies and ask for that data. And they've never had a more fertile time to get any information they want, right? And so it's a terrifying moment, right? Where you see already in China that they're using, such incredible, sophisticated surveillance to throw people into re-education camps, right? Like this is actually happening right now, and thank God, we have some levers of power here that would prevent that. But it's worth putting in place a lot of protections against that.
Thank you. Another one.
So mine is probably a banal question, but both Dick and Dennis said multiple times, and I'm an M&A reporter, and I hear this all the times when I'm talking to lawyers, is like, basically, antitrust policy is not fit to deal with all these other problems. So the question is antitrust, though, fit for this digital era or not? And if you have any remedies, because it seems that you're saying everything is fine, other people should figure out this other stuff. Don't look at us. Is this the message that you're trying to give, or do you think something should change, or there should be some reforms?
Well, if you were a lawyer and I was being deposed, I would say that's a complete mischaracterization of the message. The message is that antitrust can do certain things. I think it is appropriate to use antitrust tools to prevent someone, perhaps who has market power, from continuing to maintain that market power through what would be illegal methods. That would be exclusivity, harming your rival in a variety of ways, mergers that increase concentration. That, I think, antitrust can do pretty well. If you are asking the question, is antitrust the right tool to use to protect people's privacy? I would say I don't think so. That doesn't. It seems that would be a misuse, and you would need a different regulation for it, or a different tool, maybe consumer protection, something like that. But there are other issues that have to do, and these have been addressed by the FTC. Credit bureaus, for example, gather a lot of information. Is that good or bad? Well, and sometimes it's good because it allows people to get loans easier, because it's easy to verify your good credit risk. But it also has a problem. What are the sanctions you should impose on a credit bureau if they have errors? We can deal with that. So there are examples of dealing with some of these problems. They're not always antitrust remedies. They are regulatory remedies. And in the privacy sphere, where people are talking about creating property rights, that's not something antitrust would, someone else would have to do that. And then you would have to see, is there a misuse under the antitrust laws of those property rights? One of the things we have, no one's mentioned, is even if you have a purchase and sale of property rights, what does that do about the subsequent sale? If I sell to Google, am I giving Google the right to sell to other people?
Right.
And what about information about me, about other than me? The fact that Dick's my friend. Are they allowed to sell that? Doesn't that harm Dick? So I really think there are other, or help Dick.
I'm not ashamed of being your friend.
But all I'm saying is there are a lot of problems. Antitrust can solve some of them. There are other problems antitrust can't solve. That doesn't mean antitrust is useless. It means it's only good for some things, not others.
Let me take a slightly different tack. If you go back in the history of antitrust decisions, you will find plenty of them that talk about the importance of preserving small business. Since around 1980, antitrust has focused on competition, the competitive process, making sure it works. Now, that means small businesses get less protection, but it also means antitrust decisions are more predictable. Because if you have a policy with multiple objectives and you put it in the hands of a judge, then how are the judges going to weigh this objective against this objective against that objective? So I think antitrust has become better at protecting competition when it has focused on protecting competition. If you say, no, we'd like antitrust policy to pursue other goals, you could do that, but the result would be less predictable. And I think as a general matter, you want policies that are coherent And if you have multiple goals and you hand it to judges or to administrative bodies, you get less coherent decisions. So I think the reason antitrust can't cope with some of this stuff is it has narrowed its focus, I think appropriately.
Dick, when you say it has become better, what is the metric?
It's become better at preserving competition because that's where it has focused.
No, but
is it not as good at
what are the data to prove that?
You look at the coherence of decisions. You read antitrust decisions.
But that's just predictability. It's not necessarily. I'm not disputing. I just want to know if there is hard data that shows that competition is now better than it used to be.
No, I'm not saying it's better. I'm saying that if you look at antitrust decision making, you can say it has. Everybody's imperfect. Decisions are imperfect. Information's imperfect, but it has more clearly been about in terms of the agencies and the courts about that one central objective. Has it been better at achieving it? I would argue yes. I can't prove it, but I can say that if you've got 4 objectives and you narrow your focus to one, you're probably going to be better at pursuing that one.
Logically makes perfect sense.
That's where
I
I'm
would
going.
like to know if there is evidence in practice.
I think there is.
Okay.
If you go through the history of the, actually, I don't know if Randy is here. Randy and I have a paper on antitrust versus regulation. And we start, sort of, it's interesting. 1890, Sherman Act is passed. 1887, the ICC is created. One's a regulatory environment, one's an antitrust environment. One is adjudicated under the common law, one is not. And you can see who does better. So you should read the article. Okay. Maybe it'll convince you. But I also think if you just look, the fact that the common law has allowed antitrust to develop and just attitudes towards mergers. I mean, initially, they didn't think the antitrust laws applied to mergers, so then they changed the laws. And then various things like should oligopoly behavior be attacked? It was, and then people said, what are you attacking me for? And they stopped that, and I think it led to a more vigorous competition because people weren't afraid of competing in certain ways. So I think if you look at the history of antitrust, it's definitely been progressively improved in terms of economic outcomes. But are there new problems now that we might make mistakes about?
Yeah.
Absolutely, that didn't arise in the past.
There's
Maybe.
more concentration and less competition in almost every business sector in America since the 1980s, since the whole Bork rule that only thing that mattered was price. And you know, I mean, Amazon took 87% of all e-commerce transaction over Christmas.
How would you have prevented that? What exact rule of antitrust would have prevented that?
Maybe Amazon shouldn't have been able to buy one of the 225 acquisitions that they made over the course of the last 2 years.
That's
maybe
merger
Google
policy.
shouldn't have been able to buy YouTube.
No, but
maybe Google shouldn't have been able to buy AdMob.
That's a comment about enforcement. I actually looked at the Google AdMob transaction, and at that point, nobody, not least of all Google, owned mobile advertising. AdMob was the leader. Google was coming on. There were other players. Nobody had a magic formula. Didn't look too terrible. But if you're saying we ought to be more restrictive on mergers, sure. Would that have prevented Amazon from being the dominant online retailer? I doubt it.
Another question over there.
Thank you. I just wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit and push back against a couple of points. One, you know, Julia, you said Facebook and Google don't care about the users. Looking at the history of these two companies, when Google was sort of growing up, they were investing billions and billions of dollars into sucking up the entire internet, making search available to people, and decreasing the time to serve the best results they could possibly come up with to milliseconds, and they realized that that made the user experience much better. Same thing on the ad side. The advertisements are determined based on an auction system, and it's not who pays the most money who wins. It's the one who actually serves the best advertisement with the best landing page to the user. So and same thing is true about Facebook. There was a big focus on user experience, and it's no accident that these companies have garnered, you know, billions of users around the world. So can we really say that they don't care about the users? So that's one point. The other point I wanted to make is we're here talking about how Amazon it has garnered 80% of e-commerce transactions, and that's a bad thing, et cetera. Well, there's been enormous disruption for all the consumer packaged goods companies. Today, Procter & Gamble reported earnings, and in their press release, they say, our ecosystems and our end markets are facing disruption. And if you look at the Amazon, Jeff Bezos' letter from yesterday, half of the volumes on Amazon are through their third-party platform.
Right.
And these are small businesses that now have access to consumers around the world that they never had access to before. And the same thing is true about advertisement on Facebook. They have leveled the playing field, whereas in the 1950s, I had to be General Motors or Procter & Gamble to buy advertisement on ABC or NBC or the New York Times. Today, anybody, a small company, a small manufacturer, a small entrepreneur can go and buy advertisement on these online platforms, get a viral video on YouTube. Look at what happened to Dollar Shave Club as the best example, which went from 0 to 15% of the cartridge market overnight.
So I think you're right to call me out on that. They do care about their customers because they can't get the advertising without them. So
Exactly.
I think that, I was referring to that sort of statement you've probably heard, which is if you're not paying for the product, you're not the product, you're not the customer, right? So you're the product. And so, of course, these companies have put incredible amounts of money and innovation into making these experiences better. I would say, though, that calling out Facebook for its user interface and saying that's good, I would say, have you ever tried to change any of your settings in Facebook? I would say maybe the monopoly makes them a little lazy, right? Because it's not the greatest user interface I've ever experienced. Now Google, yes, they load fast. They're rocking it. They have more competition. Also, Google, you can still go to DuckDuckGo. I use DuckDuckGo, and you can go to Bing, which some people do.
That's pretty good.
So I guess, but I hear you on that, right? It's not like they're not doing anything. They're not just eating snacks and printing money. I want to talk about Amazon, though, because I did a big investigation into Amazon's search algorithm and how because it's interesting that they don't give you the way Google does, a whole list, right? There's one winner, and that winner gets to be in the buy box, and that's the add to cart button. And if you don't look any further, you think that's the only one. And so we did an enormous investigation of where we got 700 products, and we tested them over time and saw that Amazon consistently advantages itself as opposed to other third-party independent sellers, even if its price is not the lowest, despite the fact that they make claims that they always give the lowest price. And they do this, also they favor people who pay into their Amazon, I can't remember the name of it. No, it's called Prime Sellers or something. But basically, if you keep your stock in their distribution warehouses, which you have to pay monthly for, and those rates, by the way, are going up exponentially every year because it's almost indispensable. So all the Amazon sellers I talked to said basically you can't compete at all unless you put your stuff in those distribution centers. And even then, Amazon will still advantage itself if they're selling it and you're selling it there. And we showed that 92% of the time, Amazon won in the buy box, even when it wasn't the lowest price. So that's a number that's kind of hard to say was an aberration. Not to say it hasn't given a lot of advantages to people, but what's happening is that advantage is concentrating and Amazon is really owning it. An enormous amount of their profits nowadays come from those fees that the sellers pay to be in that program.
And just remember that they're charging extraordinary rents, even when Amazon netted on this last earnings call that the amount of time people spent on Amazon went down substantially. The amount of money they were able to get per advertising view had gone up 20%. So because of their data and their data extraction, they were able to charge rents in a way, and Google's able to do the same thing, that is extraordinary compared to, obviously, the Chicago Tribune or some other thing that doesn't have the data capabilities. And so, in some way, they're a monopsony for advertisers, just in the same way that Google is a monopsony for, if you write books, you understand that Google is constantly trying to push the price that they'll pay for books down all the time. And because they have such market power, they can do that.
Thank you. We have time for one more question over there.
just to kind of follow up a little bit on Julia's point there as regards to kind of the search algorithm and kind of the queries that are returned and the value of the data in that space. Kind of a question looking at Ben's charts and thinking through where the online growth is coming in retail as it relates to that environment. As you start also using the ability of Alexa, or like superpowering kind of like the AI kind of digital assistants, and that process is being curated for the consumer where potentially the items that they're seeing could be different than the items that other consumer can see. What's the value of the price to the market in that environment as time goes on, when consumers are essentially seeing different things in a truly one-to-one relationship? And how do competition authorities in that environment kind of then think about and check what the value is over time?
Is that a question about price discrimination, essentially?
Yeah.
Okay.
It
Can I
is.
give an anecdotal example slightly, and then let the economist bring in the theory? But we, in 2011, I believe, my team at the Wall Street Journal, we found sort of the canonical example of price discrimination online, which maybe you guys don't know about. But Staples, I think, to this day online, gives you a different price based on your zip code. And they guess your zip code because your computer tells what IP address it's at. They make a judgment of where they think you are. And then they do this crazy thing, which is a calculation of how far you are from a competitor's store, from Office Depot or Office Max, which I believe some of these have merged since then. But at any rate, it kind of makes sense in some sort of old-fashioned brain mentality, which is like, okay, if there's a price nearby. But what happens is that when we looked at it across the nation and mapped it out, it turns out that wealthier neighborhoods live closer to those stores, and so they got cheaper prices. So basically, the wealthy, whiter neighborhoods tend to be in places close to an Office Max and Office Depot, and so they were consistently getting lower prices, and people who lived further away were predominantly minority and poorer neighborhoods. And so it was sort of like an inadvertent, probably, kind of disparate impact. And it's not illegal. Nobody came down on them. We wrote about it. Everybody nodded and said, that's weird, bad impact, but oh well. But it's an interesting question because this is going to happen more and more, and it's extremely hard to find. I spend all of my time trolling for these types of things. I've only really once been able to prove it. And it was only because they did it in such a simple way, actually. When it's done more dynamically, it's very hard to catch.
Well, I think the premise of your question really has to do with price discrimination. There are a lot of examples where people in poor communities pay higher prices than people in rich communities. Grocery stores are a standard example. That, I think, is an outcome of supply and demand sometimes. But the issues about the internet and price discrimination is a little different. They know something about Dennis, and because they know his past purchasing patterns, that they can charge him a higher price. Now, price discrimination, putting aside the Robinson-Patman Act, which most economists don't like, is something that the antitrust laws generally leave alone, and that because it may not have anything to do with the process of competition. You can be a monopolist and you can be charging different prices to different people. However, I think what it does raise is, let's suppose I don't want someone to know information about my past purchasing that will be used to my disadvantage. How could I prevent that? Well, one way is I don't let my information be available. Maybe I can do it, maybe I can't. But the second way is maybe I can buy through an internet site that masks my identity. So everybody would get together and they would aggregate their purchases, and then that would be the purchasing agent. And the question, if this bothered, pardon me?
Yeah.
You can't do that with a plane ticket. Yeah, exactly. So the question is, if this is bothering you and you think it's a problem we should address, one way to address it would be to simply allow these purchasing sites that mask who you are. I gather there are such purchasing sites.
Collective bargaining for data.
Well, or collective purchasing,
Yeah.
in which you don't know my
Labor
identity.
unions for data.
So there are ways
Got it.
to deal with it if you think it's a problem that deal with the market mechanism. That might be one way around it.
But I think the greater information facilitates price discrimination, and we see it all the time. Knowing your zip code is pretty crude. They can do much more. Exactly what you would do about it under the antitrust laws is tricky. The Robinson-Patman Act is aimed at price discrimination. Most economists think that the attempts to make that workable have not come out very well, and that the Robinson-Patman Act is best left alone. But it is on the books, and it could be used by somebody somehow to go after price discrimination. But I would not be optimistic that you'd like the results.
We could continue. I think it's very interesting, and thanks for having made my work so easy. I mean, it was a very lively panel. I didn't have to do anything. I like that. So thanks a lot. And my guess is we'll have another data panel next time.
You're right about that.